Billionaire's empire couldn't heal his son until a maid's little girl stepped into their lives. In the heart of Greystone Manor, silence reigned like a curse. Billionaire Walter Harrington, a man whose name was etched on skyscrapers, could buy anything except his paralyzed son's smile. Michael had been a bright, fearless boy until a tragic accident stole his mother, his laughter, and his will to live. Doctors, therapies, and millions of dollars had failed. The mansion became a shrine of sorrow until an unexpected intruder arrived. She wasn't a doctor, a therapist, or a miracle worker. She was the maid's 10-year-old daughter, a barefoot girl with messy blonde hair and a secret gift. Her next decision would shatter the silence of Greystone Manor and reveal a connection buried for generations. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A 10-year-old girl held the secret to a miracle in her dancing feet. But she was the maid's daughter, and the miracle was for a boy trapped in silence. A boy whose billionaire father had already given up all hope. Walter Harrington was a man who commanded the world. His name was carved onto skyscrapers that pierced the clouds and etched onto the hulls of supertankers that crossed vast oceans. From technology to finance, his influence was a global force, a testament to a mind that saw angles and opportunities others could not. He was a builder of empires, a modern king whose throne was a leather chair on the 90th floor, overlooking a city that moved to his rhythm. He could buy companies, bend markets, and shape economies with a single phone call. Yet, in the sprawling, cold silence of his Greystone Manor estate, he was powerless. His vast fortune, a weapon in the outside world, was a useless pile of gold inside his own home. His greatest treasure, and his most profound failure, was in a room down the hall. His son, Michael. Just a year ago, Michael was a vibrant 10-year-old boy with his father's sharp eyes and his mother's easy laugh. The world was his playground. He would race across the endless lawns of the estate, his laughter a bright melody that warmed the stone walls of the mansion. He'd climb the ancient oak trees, his calls of "Dad, look at me," echoing with a fearless joy that Walter secretly envied. The accident had stolen everything. A rainy night, a slick road, and a moment of devastating impact had claimed the life of his beloved wife, Catherine, and shattered his son's world. Michael had survived, but the boy who returned home was a stranger. The doctors called it paralysis, a severe spinal injury that bound him to a wheelchair. But Walter knew the true diagnosis was despair. The light in his son's eyes had gone out. He sat day after day, a silent statue in his high-tech chair, his gaze fixed on a world beyond the window that he could no longer run in. The laughter was gone. The questions were gone. The boy was gone, replaced by a quiet, heartbreaking emptiness that all of Walter's money could not fill. Walter had waged war against the silence. He hired the best medical minds from around the globe, flying them in on private jets. Neurosurgeons from Switzerland, physical therapists from Germany, psychologists from Boston. They all came, spoke in hushed, complicated terms, and left with heavy checks, leaving the silence behind, undefeated. He filled Michael's room with the latest technology, voice-activated controls, and giant screens showing any movie or game imaginable. The gadgets sat untouched. The room remained a shrine to a life that was, and a prison for the life that is. Each morning, Walter would stand in the doorway of his son's room. He'd see the boy, small and frail against the large window, staring out at the gardens. And Walter Harrington, the man who could move mountains, felt the familiar, crushing weight of his own failure. He had built an empire of steel and glass, but he could not rebuild his own son's spirit. The silence in the house was more than just a lack of sound. It was a living thing, a cold fog that seeped into every corner, a constant reminder of all he had lost and all he could not fix. Into this profound quiet walked Eleanor Vance and her daughter, Abigail. Eleanor was a new hire, one of the many maids who moved silently through the grand halls of Greystone Manor. She was a woman of quiet dignity, with tired eyes that had seen hardship but held a resilient kindness. She did her work meticulously, polishing surfaces that were already gleaming, dusting furniture that was never used. She understood the unspoken rule of the house: be invisible. She needed this job. It was the only thing keeping a roof over her head and food on the table for her daughter, Abby. Abby was 10 years old, a whirlwind of blonde hair and bright, curious blue eyes. She was the opposite of everything the mansion represented. Where the house was silent, Abby hummed. Where the halls were still, Abby fidgeted. She was life itself, bundled into a small frame. Usually, Abby was in school while Eleanor worked, but today, a burst pipe had closed the school for emergency repairs. With no one else to watch her, Eleanor had been forced to bring her daughter to the manor, a decision that filled her with a deep, gnawing anxiety. She had given Abby strict instructions. You sit in the staff kitchen. You do not touch anything. You do not make a sound. And you do not, under any circumstances, leave that room. Do you understand me, Abigail? Abby had nodded, her face serious. I understand, Mama. But the kitchen was small, and the silence of the great house seemed to press in on her. After 2 hours of drawing in her notepad, her curiosity became an itch she could no longer ignore. She had heard the whispers among the staff about the master's son, the boy in the chair. Her mother had told her he was unwell and that they must never disturb him. But Abby's heart, a thing of pure and simple empathy, couldn't imagine a boy her own age sitting alone all day. Quiet as a mouse, she slipped out of the kitchen. She crept down a long, sunlit hallway, her small hand trailing along the cool marble wall. The sheer size of the place was like a cathedral. Sunlight streamed through massive windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny fairies. At the end of the hall, a set of glass doors stood open, leading out into a magnificent garden. And there, on a stone patio overlooking a sea of roses, she saw him. He was just a boy, like her. His hair was dark, and his face was pale. He sat in a wheelchair that looked more like a pilot's seat from a spaceship, all sleek black metal and buttons. His head was tilted slightly, and his eyes were fixed on a distant butterfly fluttering near a fountain. But he wasn't really seeing it. His gaze was vacant, lost in a place far away from the beautiful garden. A tray of untouched food sat on a small table beside him. A deep sadness bloomed in Abby's chest. It was a feeling she recognized. It was the same quiet ache she felt sometimes when she looked at the old, folded photograph she kept in her pocket. The picture of her great-grandfather, a young man in a soldier's uniform, his eyes brave but tinged with a sorrow she couldn't understand. Her mother had told her stories of him, Sergeant Franklin Vance, a man who had faced down fear in a great war long ago. He was a hero, her mother said, because he brought hope to people when there was none. Looking at the boy, Abby felt a strange stirring inside her. He looked like he had no hope at all. Her mother's warning echoed in her head. Don't make a sound. Don't leave the room. But another voice, a deeper one from her heart, whispered something else. He looked so lonely. Abby didn't have money. She didn't have medicine or fancy toys. She only had one thing, a small, secret gift that she used to chase away her own shadows on difficult days. When her mother looked sad, or when the hunger in her own belly was a little too loud, she would go to her room, put on a secret smile, and she would dance. It wasn't a trained dance from a fancy school. It was a dance she had made up herself. It was silly and free, a language of spinning and hopping and wiggling that spoke of pure joy. It was her way of telling the world that even when things were hard, there was still light to be found. She took a deep breath, her small heart pounding against her ribs. She looked at the boy one more time. His sadness was a wall, tall and gray. Abby decided, in that moment, that she would try to climb it. Stepping quietly from the shadow of the doorway onto the sun-drenched patio, she stood where he could see her if he chose to look. He didn't. His gaze remained distant. Without a word, Abby began to dance. She started small, with a funny little wiggle of her hips and a comical shrug of her shoulders. She lifted her knees high, like a cartoon soldier on parade. Then she spun, her blonde hair fanning out like a halo in the sunlight. She made her arms floppy like noodles and pretended to trip, catching herself at the last second with a dramatic gasp. She pulled a silly face, crossing her eyes and puffing out her cheeks. It was a dance of pure, unashamed silliness, a silent story of happiness performed just for him. For a full minute, nothing happened. Michael's expression remained unchanged, his eyes locked on the horizon. Abby's heart fell a little. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe she should run back to the kitchen before her mother found her. She was about to stop when she saw it. A flicker, Michael's eyes, so long vacant, shifted. They moved from the distant butterfly and landed on her. At first, there was only confusion in them. His brow furrowed slightly. He blinked, as if unsure if this strange, spinning girl was real. Abby saw the flicker of attention and felt a surge of courage. She danced harder. She mimicked a penguin, waddling with her feet turned out. She pretended to be a robot, moving with jerky, funny motions. She jumped and spun and fell into a heap on the soft grass, rolling around before leaping up with a grand bow, her face beaming with a hopeful grin. And then it happened. A sound. It was barely audible, a tiny puff of air, but it was there. A ghost of a chuckle. The corner of Michael's mouth twitched, threatening a smile that had been forgotten for a year. His fingers, which had lain still on the armrest of his chair, trembled slightly. Abby's heart soared. It was working. She grinned wider and launched into her grand finale. She pretended to be a ballerina, twirling on her tiptoes with exaggerated grace, before pretending to get dizzy and stumbling around in circles. She flapped her arms like a frantic chicken, her movements getting funnier and more ridiculous. A real sound escaped his lips this time. A small, raspy laugh. It was weak, fragile, like a dried leaf skittering across the pavement. But to the silent garden, it was as loud as a thunderclap. For the first time in a year, a genuine laugh had broken the spell of Greystone Manor. Michael's shoulders shook with the effort. He lifted a hand, just an inch, as if to point. A real, genuine smile finally broke through the mask of sadness on his face. He was seeing her. He was really seeing her. In that moment of shared, simple joy, neither of them noticed the tall figure standing in the doorway. Neither of them saw the shadow that fell across the patio. Walter Harrington had been walking from his study, his mind tangled in spreadsheets and legal documents, when he heard it. The sound was so alien, so long absent from these halls, that he froze. He thought he had imagined it. Laughter. He hadn't heard his son laugh in 387 days. He had counted. He moved toward the sound, his heart beginning to hammer in his chest. He reached the garden doors, expecting to see a therapist performing some new, expensive technique. He expected a medical miracle. What he saw stopped him dead. His son, Michael, was laughing. His face, usually a pale, blank canvas of sorrow, was alive with light. His eyes were sparkling. And the source of this impossible transformation was not a world-renowned doctor or a new machine. It was a small, barefoot girl with messy blonde hair. The maid's daughter. She was spinning and hopping on his perfectly manicured lawn, looking utterly ridiculous. And she was saving his son. Walter's mind struggled to process the scene. His first reaction was a surge of pure, cold fury. How dare this child trespass? Who did she think she was, invading their private grief with this circus act? Where was the security? Where was her mother? His hand instinctively reached for his phone, ready to call the head of staff, ready to have this girl and her mother thrown off his property immediately. His world was one of order, control, and privacy. This was a violation of all of it. His thumb hovered over the screen. He was about to make the call. But then he looked at his son again. Michael wasn't just laughing now. He was clapping. His hands, usually limp in his lap, were moving together in a slow, clumsy rhythm. His back, normally slumped in defeat, was straighter. His entire being was focused on the dancing girl with an intensity Walter hadn't seen since before the accident. The laughter wasn't just a sound. It was life pouring back into a vessel he thought had been permanently emptied. For months, he had poured millions of dollars into a silent void, watching the most brilliant minds in the world fail. He had offered his son the world on a silver platter, only to be met with a blank stare. Now, this little girl, with nothing but silly movements and a brave smile, had accomplished in 5 minutes what his entire empire could not. She had reached his son. Walter's anger faltered, replaced by a profound and unsettling confusion. He didn't understand what he was seeing. It defied logic. It defied medicine. It defied the fundamental rule of his life, that every problem had a solution that could be bought. He slowly lowered his hand, his phone forgotten. He stepped back, hiding himself behind one of the large stone pillars that framed the doorway. His chest felt tight, not with rage anymore, but with a fragile, unfamiliar emotion he could barely name. It was hope, a terrifying, painful, beautiful hope. He watched as the girl finished her dance with a final, dramatic fall onto the grass. She lay there for a moment, then peeked up at Michael with one eye. Michael giggled again, a clearer, stronger sound this time. "You're funny," Michael whispered. His voice was raspy from disuse, but the words were clear. The girl sat up, brushing grass from her hair. "You smiled," she said, her voice bright and happy. "My name's Abby." "Michael," he replied. Walter stood frozen behind the pillar, his heart aching. He had spent a fortune just to hear his son speak a single word. This girl had earned a whole sentence for free. He watched as his son, the boy he thought he had lost forever, had a simple conversation with the maid's daughter. And in that moment, Walter Harrington realized a shocking, humbling truth. This barefoot girl was giving his son something he couldn't. She wasn't just making him laugh. She was fighting a battle Walter had already surrendered, and she was winning. The next day, the silence had returned. Abby was gone, and Michael was once again a statue by the window. The brief flicker of life from the day before seemed like a dream. Walter found himself staring at his son, the renewed emptiness feeling sharper and more painful than before. He had tasted hope, and its absence was now a bitter poison. He spent the morning in his study, unable to focus. The numbers on his screen blurred. The commanding voice he used with his executives felt hollow. All he could think about was a silly, spinning dance and the sound of his son's laughter. He warred with himself. Pride told him it was a fluke, a momentary distraction. The order of his world demanded he ignore it. A street urchin could not be the answer. But the father in him, the part of him that was buried under years of corporate armor, screamed at him to do something. Meanwhile, in the staff quarters, Eleanor Vance was living in fear. The head housekeeper had mentioned, with a stern look, that Abby had been seen outside the kitchen. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She had apologized profusely, promising it would never happen again. She had scolded Abby, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "I told you to stay put. Do you have any idea the trouble you could have caused? We could be thrown out, Abby. What were you thinking?" Abby looked down at her worn sneakers. "He looked sad, Mama. I just wanted to make him smile. Like I do for you sometimes." Her voice was small. "I made him laugh." Eleanor's anger dissolved, leaving only the weary weight of her circumstances. She pulled her daughter into a hug, her heart aching. "Oh, my sweet girl. You have a heart of gold, but the world isn't always kind to hearts like ours. You must be careful." She made Abby promise to stay in the kitchen for the entire day. Abby agreed, her face downcast. The memory of Michael's smile felt like a secret treasure, one she was now forbidden from sharing. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Walter could bear the silence no longer. He made a decision that went against every instinct he had. He walked down to the main kitchen, a place he hadn't set foot in for years. The staff stopped their work, their eyes wide with shock at his sudden appearance. He scanned the room until he saw Eleanor, who was nervously polishing a silver tray. "Mrs. Vance," he said. His voice was formal, cold. Eleanor jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. This was it. They were being fired. "Yes, Mr. Harrington," she whispered, unable to meet his eyes. "Where is your daughter?" The question hung in the air. Eleanor's hands trembled. She is in the staff break room, sir. I am so terribly sorry. She will not be a bother again, I promise." Walter looked at the terrified woman before him. For a moment, he saw not just an employee, but a mother, just as scared and desperate as he was. It softened the edge in his voice. "Bring her to the garden patio," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Now." He turned and walked away, leaving a stunned and terrified Eleanor in his wake. With a sense of impending doom, she fetched Abby. She held her daughter's hand tightly as they walked through the grand halls. "I don't know what this is about," she whispered to Abby. "Just be polite. Say yes, sir, and no, sir. And please do not say anything out of turn." When they reached the garden, they saw Michael, sitting in his usual spot by the roses. Walter stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Abby's heart did a little flip when she saw Michael. He looked just as sad as he had before. Michael's head lifted as they approached. His eyes found Abby, and for the first time that day, a flicker of recognition, of hope, appeared on his face. Walter saw it. He had been watching his son closely, and the change was undeniable. The moment the girl appeared, the gray fog around Michael seemed to thin. Walter turned his imposing gaze to Abby. She shrank back slightly behind her mother. "You," he said, his voice flat. Yesterday, you were dancing. Abby swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, sir. Why? Abby looked from Walter's stern face to Michael's hopeful one. She found her courage. He looked lonely, sir, she said softly. Dancing makes things better. Does it? Walter challenged, his voice laced with skepticism. I have spent a fortune on the world's best doctors. They have not made things better. What makes you think your wiggling can do anything? The words were sharp, intended to dismiss her, to put her back in her place. But Abby didn't flinch. She thought of the stories of her great-grandfather. He wasn't the biggest or the richest soldier, but he was the bravest. I don't know anything about doctors, sir, she replied, her voice steady and clear. I just know that sometimes sadness is like a big, heavy blanket. You can't buy it off. You can't order it off. But sometimes a little bit of sunshine can peek through. A laugh is like a little bit of sun. Walter was taken aback by her simple, profound wisdom. He looked at his son, who was now watching Abby with rapt attention, hanging on her every word. He looked at Eleanor, who stood pale and silent, her eyes pleading. He had come out here to assert his authority, to put an end to this bizarre anomaly. But looking at his son's face, he found he couldn't. He let out a long, slow breath, the sound of a man surrendering a battle he didn't know he was fighting. Fine, he said, the word feeling strange in his mouth. He pointed to an open patch of lawn. Dance. Abby's face broke into a brilliant smile. Eleanor looked at him in disbelief. Michael's own smile returned, wider this time. Go on, Walter said, his voice softer now. He gestured for Eleanor to take a seat on a nearby bench. Let's see this sunshine. And so, with the billionaire and the maid as her audience, Abby began to dance again. She danced with even more energy than the day before. She felt a purpose now. She wasn't just a curious girl. She was on a mission. She danced the story of a clumsy bumblebee, of a wind-up toy soldier, of a fish flopping on a dock. Michael's laughter returned, stronger and more confident than before. He clapped his hands, his movements less clumsy. He even shouted suggestions. Do a monkey. Do a monkey. Abby happily obliged, scratching her arms and making funny monkey sounds, which sent Michael into peals of laughter. For 10 minutes, the garden was filled with the sounds of pure, uncomplicated joy. Walter stood by, a silent observer, his corporate world fading into the background. He was no longer a CEO or a titan of industry. He was just a father, watching a miracle unfold on his lawn. When Abby finished, breathless and beaming, Walter gave her a short, stiff nod. He turned to Eleanor. Your daughter will be permitted in the garden every day, from 3 to 4 o'clock. She is to do this, and nothing else. Do you understand? Eleanor could only nod, her mind reeling. And Mrs. Vance, he added, looking at her directly, you will be compensated for this extra service. Before Eleanor could protest that it wasn't necessary, he had turned and walked back into the house, his expression as stern as ever. But as he walked down the marble hall, alone and out of sight, Walter Harrington touched his own cheek and was surprised to find it was wet with tears. And so, a strange and sacred ritual was born at Greystone Manor. Every afternoon, as the clock in the great hall chimed 3, a quiet anticipation would settle over the house. Eleanor would smooth down Abby's dress, whispering a final reminder to be good. Abby, her heart fluttering with excitement, would race to the garden patio. And Michael, who now spent his mornings watching the clock, would already be there, his wheelchair positioned by the roses, a look of genuine eagerness on his face. The first week was a whirlwind of dance. Abby's imagination was a bottomless well of silliness. She was a T-Rex trying to make a sandwich with its tiny arms. She was a leaky faucet, drip, drip, drip plopping across the lawn. She was a strand of spaghetti in a pot of boiling water. Each new performance was met with fresh peals of laughter from Michael. The sound, once so fragile, grew richer and stronger each day, echoing across the grounds like a long-forgotten song. Walter made it a point to be in his study during that hour, the garden doors slightly ajar. He told himself it was to supervise, to ensure nothing went awry. But he knew he was a willing captive, listening to the sounds of his son's returning joy. He would stand by the window, partially hidden by a curtain, and watch. He saw how Michael's posture improved, his back straighter, his head held higher. He noticed his son's hands, once listless, were now active, clapping, pointing, and gesturing. It was during the second week that their ritual began to change. It was no longer just about the dance. It became about friendship. After one particularly energetic performance where Abby pretended to be a melting snowman, she plopped onto the grass beside Michael's chair, panting and laughing. "That was the best one," Michael declared, his voice clearer than it had been in a year. "I'm running out of ideas," Abby confessed, wiping her brow. "What should I be tomorrow?" Michael pondered, a serious look on his face. "Could you be a brave knight fighting a dragon?" Abby's eyes lit up. "A knight? Yes, a brave one. Like my great-grandpa." Michael's brow furrowed. "Your great-grandpa was a knight?" Abby giggled. "No, silly. He was a soldier. A sergeant. Mama says he was a hero." She reached into the pocket of her simple cotton dress and pulled out a small, worn object wrapped in a piece of cloth. She carefully unwrapped it to reveal an old photograph, its corners soft with age and handling. She held it out for Michael to see. The black-and-white picture showed a young man in a crisp army uniform. He was handsome, with kind eyes and a firm jaw, but there was a shadow of seriousness in his expression that spoke of heavy burdens. "That's him," Abby said softly, her voice full of reverence. "Sergeant Franklin Vance. My mama says he was the bravest man she ever knew, even though she never met him. He fought in a big war, a long, long time ago. She said he used to tell my grandma that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means you do what's right, even when your knees are knocking together." Michael leaned forward in his chair, studying the photograph with intense curiosity. He had grown up surrounded by portraits of powerful men in business suits. His grandfather, his father. They looked important and wealthy. But this man, this Sergeant Vance, looked different. He looked strong in a way that had nothing to do with money. What did he do that was so brave? Michael asked, his voice a whisper. Mama said he saved his whole platoon. They were trapped, and he did something really clever and really dangerous to get them out. She said he never liked to talk about it, though. He just said, "You take care of the people next to you. That's all that matters." Abby carefully rewrapped the photo and tucked it back into her pocket as if it were a precious jewel. "So tomorrow," she announced, her tone shifting back to playful, "I will be Sir Abby the Brave, and I will fight a pretend dragon for you." From his window, Walter watched this exchange, a strange feeling twisting in his gut. He had seen the old photograph. He had heard the name, Franklin Vance. It meant nothing to him, just the ancestor of an employee. Yet, the reverence in the girl's voice and the captivated look on his son's face struck a chord within him. His own father had served in the military, a brief, unremarkable stint before taking over the family business. They never spoke of it. His family's legacy was written in stock prices and profit margins, not in acts of battlefield courage. The daily sessions evolved. The first half hour was for dancing, and the second half was for stories. Abby, fueled by tales passed down from her mother, would recount the adventures of Sergeant Vance. They were simple stories, likely embellished through generations, but they were filled with lessons of courage, honor, and kindness. Michael drank them in. He began to see the world not just as a place of loss, but as a place where bravery could exist. One afternoon, Michael's physical therapist, a gentle but firm man named David, was working with him on his hand exercises. For months, it had been a frustrating, fruitless routine. Michael's grip was weak, his motivation non-existent. "Okay, Michael," David said patiently, holding out a small rubber ball. "Let's try for 10 squeezes today." Michael looked at the ball. He remembered one of Abby's stories, how Sergeant Vance had to hold a broken radio wire together for an hour in the freezing cold so his captain could call for help. Abby had said, his fingers were numb, but he didn't let go. He just squeezed tighter. Michael took the ball. He squeezed. Once. Twice. His arm trembled. He squeezed again, his face tight with concentration. He pushed past 10, reaching 15 before his strength gave out. David stared, his mouth slightly agape. "Michael, that was incredible. Where did that come from?" Michael just gave a small, determined smile. "You just have to squeeze tighter," he said. The improvements began to stack up, like small stones building a foundation. He started moving his toes. He could push the wheels of his chair a few inches by himself. During his sessions, he was more engaged, more willing to try. The medical staff was mystified. His doctor, a renowned neurologist, examined him during a monthly checkup. His nerve response is improving at a rate I can't explain, Walter, Dr. Evans told him over the phone. It's statistically improbable. His mood, his motivation, it's like a different child. Whatever you're doing, for God's sake, keep doing it. It's working better than any treatment we've designed. Walter hung up the phone, a grim satisfaction settling over him. He was doing something. Or rather, he was allowing something to be done. He was allowing a 10-year-old girl to unravel a tragedy that had baffled science. His new routine disturbed the perfectly ordered world of his business life. One afternoon, his longtime business partner and friend, George Roth, came to the manor to discuss an urgent merger. George was a man much like Walter, pragmatic, ruthless, and disdainful of anything that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. They were in Walter's study when the sound of Michael's laughter drifted in from the garden. George paused mid-sentence. "Is that Michael?" he asked, surprised. "Yes," Walter said, his face impassive. George walked to the window and peered out. He saw the scene. The boy in the wheelchair, clapping and smiling, and the small blonde girl making a fool of herself on the lawn. He turned back to Walter, an expression of utter disbelief on his face. "What on earth is going on, Walter? Who is that child?" "She's the maid's daughter," Walter replied, his tone daring George to comment. George let out a short, incredulous laugh. "The maid's daughter? You're letting a servant's child run wild on your grounds? Walter, this is your son's therapy? Have you lost your senses? What will people say? It looks undignified, unseemly." The words struck a nerve, hitting the last vestiges of Walter's old pride. A year ago, he would have agreed. He would have been mortified. But now, the criticism felt shallow, meaningless. "What people say, George," Walter said, his voice dangerously quiet, "has not helped my son move his fingers. What people say has not made him laugh. My dignity did not stop him from wanting to give up on life." He walked to stand beside George at the window, his gaze fixed on the two children. "That little girl out there, she has done more than a team of doctors I paid over $3 million. So, if you don't mind, we can either discuss the merger, or you can see yourself out. But the circus, as you might call it, will continue." George was stunned into silence. He had never heard Walter speak with such raw, personal conviction. He saw then that his friend was a changed man. The cold, calculating titan of industry had been replaced by a fiercely protective father. He simply nodded and returned to the table. The subject dropped. That evening, Walter found Eleanor polishing the silver in the grand dining room. He had seen her every day, but he realized he had never truly spoken to her. "Mrs. Vance," he began, making her jump. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her head bowed. "Your daughter," he said. "She talks about her great-grandfather. A soldier." Eleanor's face softened, a rare, gentle smile appearing. "Yes, sir. Franklin Vance. My grandfather. He was a good man. The best of them. Abby seems to know a lot about him," Walter prompted. "I tell her the stories my mother told me," Eleanor explained. "It's all I have to give her, really. A legacy, not of money, but of character. I want her to know where she comes from, that she comes from someone brave and good." Eleanor hesitated, worried she had spoken too freely. "I hope she has not been bothering Michael with her stories, sir." "On the contrary," Walter said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I believe they are helping him immensely. Thank you, Mrs. Vance." He paused. "For everything." He left her there, standing in the cavernous dining room, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. But her relief was always tinged with fear. She saw how close Abby and Michael were becoming. They shared secrets now, whispered jokes. Abby would sometimes rest her head on the arm of Michael's chair, and he would instinctively reach out and touch her hair. They were becoming best friends, two children in their own little world. Eleanor knew that world was fragile. They were employees. They were temporary. What would happen when Michael no longer needed Abby's dances? What would happen when he was better? The Harrington family would move on, and her daughter, who had given so much of her heart, would be left behind. The thought was a constant, heavy weight on her own heart. She started saving every extra dollar Walter gave her, a tiny, desperate fund for the day she would inevitably have to mend her daughter's broken heart. One late afternoon, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Abby was telling Michael her favorite story. So great-grandpa Franklin knew they had to cross the open field, but the enemy was watching. Everyone was scared, but he found a little creek, all muddy and full of reeds. He told everyone to get in the creek and crawl. They crawled for hours in the cold, smelly mud. But the enemy never saw them. He got all of them to safety. Michael listened, his eyes wide. He wasn't scared? Oh, he was terrified, Abby said matter-of-factly. Mama said he told Grandma his teeth were chattering so loud he was afraid the enemy would hear them. But he did it anyway. That's what matters. Michael looked down at his own legs, still and useless beneath his blanket. They were his open field, his enemy. For so long, the thought of trying to make them work was too terrifying to even consider. The doctors had told him it was possible, that the nerves were damaged but not severed. They said it would take a monumental effort of will, an effort he didn't have. But now, thinking of a young man crawling through mud, his teeth chattering with fear, something shifted inside him. Fear was not the end. It was just a feeling. Abby, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I want to try something. What is it? She asked, her blue eyes full of concern. He took a deep breath. I want to try to stand. The words hung in the air. Abby's eyes widened. She had never heard him speak with such determination. Inside the house, Walter, who had been listening from his study, felt his heart stop. He moved silently, quickly, to the doorway, his entire being focused on the scene unfolding on the patio. Michael's face was pale, beaded with sweat. Help me, he asked Abby. Just hold my hand. Don't let me fall. I won't, Abby promised, her own voice a whisper. She moved to his side and took his hand. It felt cold and clammy, but she held it tight. Okay, Michael breathed. He looked at the armrests of his chair. He placed his hands upon them, his knuckles white. He pushed. His arms shook with a violent tremor. A low grunt of effort escaped his lips. For a few seconds, nothing happened. His body refused. The despair, the old enemy, whispered in his ear that it was useless. Think of the mud, Michael, Abby whispered fiercely beside him. Your teeth are chattering, but you have to do it. You have to be brave. Michael shut his eyes. He pictured a young man in a uniform. He pushed again, this time with a raw cry that was part pain, part frustration, part pure will. Slowly, miraculously, his hips lifted from the seat. An inch. Then two. His legs, weak and atrophied, trembled uncontrollably. He was unsteady, crooked, but he was doing it. His feet, for the first time in over a year, were pressing against the ground, bearing his own weight. He was standing. Walter's breath caught in his throat. A strangled sound escaped his lips. Abby gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, though she never let go of Michael's. Michael held the position for 3 eternal seconds. His whole world was shaking, his vision blurring. But he was up. He was looking down at his own feet, standing on the solid earth. Then, his strength gave out, and he collapsed back into the chair, panting, his body drenched in sweat. The garden was utterly silent for a moment. It was the silence of awe, of a prayer answered. Then Abby broke it with a joyous shout. You did it. Michael, you stood up. She threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. Michael was crying, but he was also laughing. A wild, beautiful, triumphant sound. I did it, he gasped. I stood. From the doorway, Walter fell back against the stone pillar, his own legs suddenly weak. The tears he had held back for so long finally came, not as a trickle, but as a flood. He slid down the pillar to his knees, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. His son was standing. His son was fighting. The war was not over. The battle had just been won. The sound of Walter's sobbing was swallowed by the thick stone of the manor. He remained on his knees for a long time, the cold of the marble floor seeping into his expensive trousers, a fitting penance for a man who had given up too soon. He had tried to conquer his son's grief with power and money, the only tools he knew. He had treated the problem like a hostile takeover, throwing resources at it until it submitted. But grief was not a corporation. It was a fog, and the only thing that had pierced it was the genuine, unpurchasable light of a little girl's kindness. He finally pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, a gesture he hadn't made since he was a boy. Composing himself, he smoothed his suit jacket and walked out onto the patio. Abby and Michael looked up as he approached. Their triumphant celebration quieted, the ever-present awareness of his authority settling back over them. Michael looked nervous, as if he had broken a rule. Abby instinctively took a small step back, her hand still resting protectively on Michael's shoulder. Walter looked down at his son. The boy's face was flushed with exertion and pride. His eyes, which for so long had been dull and empty, were shining with life. For the first time in a year, Walter didn't see a patient. He saw his son. "I saw that, Michael," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw you stand." Michael gave him a wobbly, exhausted smile. "Abby helped me," he said. Walter's gaze shifted to the small girl beside the wheelchair. She looked up at him, her blue eyes wide and uncertain. She was just a child in a simple dress, with grass stains on her knees and a smudge of dirt on her cheek. Yet, in that moment, she seemed to possess a power greater than his own. He knelt down, an action that felt both foreign and necessary, bringing himself to her level. The fabric of his $1,000 suit pressed against the stone patio. "Abby," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Thank you." The two words were simple, but they carried the weight of a year of agony. They were an admission of his failure and a recognition of her victory. Abby seemed to relax. "Michael did it," she said honestly. "He was the brave one." Bravery, Walter mused, a new thought taking root in his mind. "It seems to run in your family." He looked at her, a serious, searching expression on his face. "Abby, I want to give you something. For what you've done. You can ask for anything you want. Anything at all. A new house for your mother. A college education. A trust fund. You name it, and it's yours." He expected her eyes to light up. He expected a wish list, the kind any child would have. It was the Harrington way, to solve every problem, to show every gratitude, with a checkbook. But Abby didn't ask for a pony or a pile of toys. She didn't ask for a mansion or money. She bit her lip and thought for a moment. Then she looked at Michael, and her expression was one of pure, simple friendship. "Can I just be Michael's friend?" she asked, her voice small but clear. "For real? Not just because my mama works here. I don't want any money for it. Friends don't get paid." The request was so pure, so completely devoid of greed, that it struck Walter with the force of a physical blow. He had offered her a fortune, and she had asked for a friendship. This child, who had so little, understood the value of things he had spent a lifetime overlooking. He felt a profound sense of shame, followed by an overwhelming wave of admiration. He reached out and put a hand on her small shoulder. "Yes, Abby," he said, his voice cracking. "You can be Michael's friend. For as long as you both shall live." That night, Walter did not work. He did not look at stock reports or take calls from overseas. He sat in his cavernous library, a glass of untouched whiskey on the table beside him. The name echoed in his mind. Sergeant Franklin Vance. He thought of the worn photograph. He thought of the stories of a man who crawled through mud to save his friends. He thought of the legacy of character that Eleanor spoke of, the only inheritance she could give her daughter. And he thought of his own legacy. What was he leaving Michael? A portfolio of assets? A collection of companies? He was leaving him a kingdom of things, but he had almost let his son's character wither and die. An idea, born from the strange events of the past weeks, began to take hold. It was a long shot, a whisper of a possibility, but he couldn't shake it. He opened his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys. He didn't search for business analytics. He hired a man he kept on retainer for the most sensitive corporate and personal matters, a discreet, ruthlessly efficient researcher and private investigator based in Washington, D.C. The instructions he typed were simple and cryptic. Find everything you can on a U.S. Army sergeant named Franklin Vance. Served in World War II. Focus on commendations, service records, and platoon rosters. I need it yesterday. The next few days were a blur of progress and anticipation. Michael, buoyed by his success, was a new boy. He now dedicated a part of each day with his physical therapist to standing practice. It was grueling work. He would fall back into his chair, gasping and frustrated, but he would never give up. Abby was always there, standing just out of reach, shouting encouragement. "You can do it, Michael. Be brave like the sergeant." Walter's researcher was fast. The first file arrived within 48 hours. It was a digitized service record. Franklin Vance. Enlisted at 18. Fought in the European theater. Walter scanned the document, his eyes catching on the list of campaigns. The Battle of the Bulge. The Hurtgen Forest. Names that spoke of unimaginable hardship and courage. A second file arrived the next day. It was a list of commendations. A Purple Heart. A Bronze Star. Walter read the citation for the Bronze Star, his heart pounding. for heroic achievement in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. Sergeant Vance, with complete disregard for his own safety, exposed himself to heavy enemy fire to retrieve a wounded comrade, dragging him back to the safety of the line. Walter sat back, the words blurring on the screen. This was Abby's great-grandfather, a certified hero. But the connection he was searching for, the one his gut told him was there, remained elusive. He pushed the researcher. I need platoon records. Who served alongside him? Specifically, I'm looking for anyone who served in his company from my family's home state. The waiting was agony. During the day, he watched the children. Their friendship was a beautiful, natural thing. They would read books together in the garden, Abby's clear voice bringing stories to life. They played board games on a table set up on the patio, their laughter a constant melody. Eleanor, seeing the genuine bond, began to let go of her fear, allowing herself to feel a quiet, cautious joy. She saw her daughter happy, and she saw the boy, Michael, healing before her very eyes. She started to believe, just a little, that maybe this time the world would be kind to her daughter's good heart. Then, on a gray, overcast afternoon, the final email arrived. The subject line was just 2 words, file attached. Walter's hand trembled as he clicked it open. It was a scanned copy of a decades-old document, a handwritten letter from a military archive. The penmanship was faint, the paper yellowed with age. It was an unofficial after-action report, written by a young captain to his commanding officer, detailing the events of a brutal firefight. Walter began to read. The captain described his platoon being pinned down, ambushed in a dense forest. Their radio was out, and they were surrounded. He wrote of the chaos, the fear, the certainty that they would not survive the night. And then, he mentioned a young sergeant, Sergeant Franklin Vance. He described how Vance had noticed a weakness in the enemy line, how he had organized a small group of men for a flanking maneuver. It was a suicidal plan, but it was their only chance. Walter's eyes scanned down the page, his breath catching in his chest. The captain wrote, Sergeant Vance led the charge himself. One of the men who volunteered was a young private, a boy from back home. Really. He was hit almost immediately. Vance, under a hail of machine gun fire, turned back for him. He shielded the boy with his own body while returning fire, allowing the rest of us to gain a foothold. He saved the private's life, and, in doing so, saved us all. Walter's world tilted on its axis. He scrolled to the end of the letter, to the captain's signature. And then he saw it. The list of the men in the platoon. His eyes scanned the names, searching, praying, dreading. And there it was. Under the heading, Wounded in Action, was a name that made the air leave his lungs. Private Stephen Harrington. His father. Walter fell back in his chair, the letter swimming before his eyes. His father. The quiet, stern man who had built a small company into a regional power. The man who had rarely spoken of the war, who had dismissed his service as just something a man did back then. That man was the young private, the boy whose life had been saved by a brave sergeant who shielded him with his own body. Abby's great-grandfather had saved his father's life. Everything Walter was, everything he had, the empire, the mansion, the name carved on skyscrapers, was a direct result of that one, single act of selfless bravery in a dark forest half a century ago. His father had come home from that war, married, built his business, and had a son. Without Franklin Vance, there would be no Stephen Harrington. There would be no Walter Harrington. There would be no Michael. The debt was so immense, so profound, it was beyond comprehension. And for decades, it had gone unpaid, unknown. It had been repaid not by his family's vast fortune, but by the simple, inherited kindness of the hero's great-granddaughter, dancing on his lawn for a boy she barely knew. The cosmic irony of it, the beautiful, heartbreaking symmetry, was overwhelming. He finally understood. It wasn't about charity. It wasn't about rewarding a good deed. It was about honoring a sacred debt that was the very foundation of his existence. That evening, he asked Eleanor and Abby to meet him in the library. They entered timidly, and used to being in the formal heart of the manor. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the leather-bound books. Michael was there too, sitting in his wheelchair by the fire. "Please, sit down," Walter said, his voice gentle. He gestured to 2 plush armchairs. Eleanor and Abby sat, their hands folded nervously in their laps. Walter took a deep breath. He held the printed-out letter in his hand. "Eleanor," he began, "you told me you wanted to give your daughter a legacy of character, a connection to someone brave and good." "Yes, sir," she whispered, confused. "I have spent my life building a different kind of legacy, one of money and power," Walter continued. "Today, I learned that my legacy, my entire life, was built on a foundation I knew nothing about. It was built on the character of your grandfather." He looked at Abby. "Your great-grandfather." He then told them the story. He read from the captain's letter, his voice thick with emotion as he described the firefight, the ambush, and the incredible bravery of Sergeant Franklin Vance. When he got to the part about the wounded private, he paused, his eyes locking with Eleanor's. "The young private Sergeant Vance saved, the man whose life he shielded with his own body. That man was my father." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Abby's eyes were wide with disbelief. "My family owes your family everything," Walter said, the words coming from the deepest part of his soul. "My wealth, my company, my son. It all exists because of Franklin Vance. And for 50 years, we never knew. We never had the chance to say thank you." He set the papers down and walked over to stand before Eleanor. "I cannot repay the debt of one life with another, but I can honor it. I am establishing a charitable foundation, the Sergeant Franklin Vance Foundation. It will be dedicated to providing educational grants and medical assistance to the families of wounded veterans. His name, his legacy of bravery, will help thousands of people." Eleanor was crying silently, tears of shock and overwhelming emotion streaming down her face. "And for you," Walter said, his voice softening, "this is no longer your place of work. This is your home. I have had the carriage house on the south end of the estate completely renovated. It's a beautiful 3-bedroom home by the lake. It is yours. There is no rent. There are no bills. It will be yours for as long as you choose to live there." He then looked at Abby, a warm, genuine smile on his face. "And you, Abby Vance, your request is granted. You will be Michael's friend. You will go to the same school. You will have tutors. You will have everything you need. You are not the maid's daughter. You are a part of this family. You saved my son. Your great-grandfather saved my father. You are family." The story of Greystone Manor changed that day. The silence was gone for good, replaced by the constant sound of 2 children's laughter. Eleanor Vance, no longer a maid, became the respected administrator of the Vance Foundation, finding a purpose she had never dreamed of. Abby and Michael were inseparable. Months later, on a bright spring afternoon, Walter stood on the garden patio. He watched as Michael, leaning heavily on a walker, took slow, deliberate steps across the lawn. Abby walked backward in front of him, her face alight with encouragement. "You're doing it," she cheered. "Just a little further." Michael grinned, his face beaded with sweat, and took another step. He was walking. Walter felt a hand slip into his. It was Eleanor. They stood together, no longer master and servant, but 2 parents watching their children, their families bound by an old act of heroism and a new act of love. Walter Harrington, the man who once commanded the world, finally understood what it meant to be truly rich. It was not in the soaring towers that bore his name, but in the sound of his son's laughter. It was in the courage of a young girl who danced in the face of sadness. And it was in the long-overdue payment of a debt, a legacy of kindness that had traveled through generations to heal them all. The mansion was no longer a cold monument to his wealth. It was a home, warmed by the enduring light of a hero's love. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive stories.